So thanks everybody. Thank you to the Canadian RDC Network. I am really happy we got to do this. I'll be brief with my policy pitch, and then I'm waiting for your comments and feedback. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted how vital neighborhoods are to overcome crisis. Where communities are strong, neighbors can rely on one another. Support can mean delivering groceries to older people living by themselves, or simply checking on each other's health. These scenarios, among others, show that interpersonal trust is paramount for strong communities. My project's primary goal is to shed light on the relationship between trust and the built environment of neighborhoods across Canadian cities. First, I draw on spatial autocorrelation methods using general social survey data to show that trust is spatially concentrated. That means people with similar levels of trust tend to be in proximity to one another. Second, I use multi-level models to show that the spatial composition of cities, measured through people's proximity to amenities like libraries, parks, and schools, is positively correlated with trust. The association holds even when we consider population density and other traditional predictors of trust, like membership to voluntary associations and the number of non-close friends. Third, I provide modest evidence that amenity-dense neighborhoods mediate the relationship between those individual level predictors and trust. In other words, the density of amenities promotes the kind of recurrent casual encounters that lead to higher levels of trust. In sum, trust matters because it increases our capacity to act together, particularly against common challenges like crime or widespread crisis. Urban policy can foster trust through planning and investment decisions. First, policymakers can promote walkable neighborhoods, prioritizing pedestrian connectivity and accessibility to amenities, particularly those that create opportunities for everyday encounters like parks, grocery stores, and restaurants. Second, neighborhoods benefit from investing in their social infrastructure. In other words, funding community centers, libraries, and after-school programs has direct impacts on people's lives and must be an urban policy priority. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Fernando. Okay, so if we could get our judges back for the Q&A. The first question is going to come from Umit Kiziltan.
Well, thank you very much, Grant, to everyone around this virtual table. So Fernando, I have two questions, so I'm kind of torn. But how do you think immigration and diversity could have been, or maybe in a future study, be integrated in your account of, or in your study of trust? As you know, there is lots of literature on that. And obviously a follow-up, you don't have to answer it now, but it's in terms of even your particular study, in terms of its impact or significance for policies at federal, provincial, local level for immigration and settlement, trust and those policies.
Should I answer now or I wait?
Yep, take it away now.
All right. So yeah, regarding the influence of this of immigration and diversity, I've been running this project for a few years now, and I've tried several models that include several different variables about recent immigration, visible minorities. We found some interesting results regarding how immigration may be like the length of immigration to the country may develop trust over time, so people become more trusting as they spend more time in Canada. The thing is that we didn't, in particularly in this case, I didn't include this because it's inconsistent for different years, the way that got measured in the General Social Survey. So it was really hard and data-wise to do that, but I'm definitely on board on providing more in that direction. I'm familiar with some of that literature, and I think it's probably one of the points that we wanted to make is that in contexts like the Canadian context, a lot of the literature about trust and diversity comes from the US and tends to emphasize this idea that more diversity leads to less trusting communities, right? And actually Canada proves otherwise. And so we have some tools for that. And currently I'm working to use more data, not only from GSS, but from the community health survey, which I think has a bit more detailed information. And yeah, definitely, I think this is a priority for the next project that we're engaging with.
Okay, so I'm going to call on Tammy to ask the next question.
Sure. Thank you, Fernando. This is a really interesting project you're working on. And when you're talking about policy, you're framing it in terms of how the amenities we have and how we organize our communities might foster trust. But I'm wondering the extent to which you've thought about how individuals' willingness to trust affects where they decide where to live.
Yeah. Yes, thank you for that. I think it's both ways around, right? Like this is the more quantitative part of a project that is involved in the overall research that I do about neighborhoods. And as a course instructor and a TA, I've encountered multiple undergraduate students who've done research on specific neighborhoods, and they've done interviews and things like that. And we found that causal arrow to be going in both directions. So I know that question comes to that point. And so that's why this is the emphasis is more on the correlation that we see than what's the causality, because we've found that both things have happened, at least in the accounts that we've encountered through interviews and other sources. So for one, there's stories about or interviews about families that move into the suburbs after living a long time in neighborhoods that are more dense, like amenity dense. And then they become more interested in like individual issues, less interested in like in community situations, and trust can be correlated with that. And the opposite thing, like moving into a neighborhood because you think, oh, I want to live in a more community-oriented environment, right? So I think it's both ways, and that's why with additional data we hope to untangle a bit more that directionality. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Claudia.
Hi, thank you for that. Really enjoyed your video, really interesting piece of work. Loved how you brought together the GSS data with the new measures that StatCan is putting out. So nice to see it in action. I'm going to just ask, so you mentioned lots of things in which policymakers can do with this information. Excuse me. If you had the Minister of INFC, Infrastructure Canada, and you had to direct her to or make recommendations about where you would spend your money in terms of infrastructure and built environment, what would your recommendation be?
Oh, that's one of my dreams, to have that power. just because I think it's such an important part of our cities, right? One thing that I believe it's a ongoing discussion for which a lot of evidence is not being produced is the importance of density, not only in terms of population density, but of these kind of amenities and things like that. And what happens usually for me, in my view, is that we kind of wait until the market drives things, which is a good sign. Like we're listening to evidence of what the market is doing, like price points and things like that. But sometimes it's too late. By the time like the market is already interested in a neighborhood where there's investment on increasing density, then you have prices that are like skyrocketing, and building affordable housing, promoting small businesses becomes too difficult because they can't afford to pay rent in those areas, right? So I think my point of view is to provide evidence of early development around how mid-density investment can be done early on, so that you don't wait until the condo boom takes over and then it's too late for future investment.
Okay, and let's have Monica.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really interesting. I think one of the things I wanted to ask is when you go with trust, some of it comes with life experiences. And so I'm wondering if further research could be done with, especially with the variable of age, and understanding that in particular, some areas where the age population's a little more and trust is built over time. So have you given further thought to that?
Yeah, thank you for that. I am fascinated about the relationship between trust and age, to be honest. It's one of the, as a social scientist, I think it's one of the more interesting questions about that. What we've seen in the research is that at least people, age is one of the stronger correlations of higher reported levels of trust. So people who live like older people tend to report more trust to one another. But then we have this other variable that we're just starting to work with that has to do with the difference between trusting strangers versus trust in neighbors, like trying to measure that radius of trust. And in that case, it's actually the opposite. Like people with with age, people become apparently, at least from what we are seeing, this is very still early to having a more causal direction. But it seems to be that people in the higher cohorts tend to have more narrow sense of community. Like it's not that they trust people broadly, it becomes more, they become more trusting, but particularly around certain groups of people, immediate community, family members, and things like that. I'm really intrigued about this in more detail. And again, this is one of the questions I think we're trying to tackle with additional data points because the GSS, this particular point is every 5 years. With the community health survey, we want to do a bit more, closer data points in time. So yeah, I'm really intrigued about that. Thank you.
Okay, and before we move to Hugh, I just want to remind everyone in the audience that your turn is coming. So if you can pop your questions for Fernando into the Q&A box, then we'll have time to answer them shortly. But moving on, Hugh, can you ask your question?
Yes, thank you very much. I really enjoyed your presentation. I have two questions, but in the interest of time, I'll just ask one if that's okay. I was wondering, not having seen that CMHC data, could you be able to further the analysis by, suggesting what is better for a community in terms of trust, by building a library or maybe a schoolyard or something along that lines, or was it just use this holistic kind of unit of these social spaces? Could you be able to drill down with that?
Thank you. That's also, I think, a challenge because of how fine-grained data we would need to be able to distinguish those. I've tried several models for that using only combinations to see if there's a kind of like a sensitivity check, like using some, removing some other amenities. It's hard to tell because like the models, like the effects can be minimal, and then they're only visible at the aggregate level. But I'm hoping, again, that further analysis can be done. I think probably one of the best ways to do this is through with like that kind of like long-term data, seeing new infrastructures that have got built. So, or investment that was done, right? And part of that comes from a different project that's related to this that I'm working on that has to do with the priority areas that were designed for Toronto in like the early 2000s, where there was investment in some of these neighborhoods, particularly in libraries and community centers. So we're trying to publish one article on that project, but there's another direction that has to do with how these neighborhoods got investments, particularly libraries and community centers that were like the two pillars of that. And so, yeah, I think we might be able to untangle this a bit more, at least at those two combined elements. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Fernando. Do any of the judges have any further questions for Fernando? Just open it up. Umit or Claudia, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So again, as mentioned, really intrigued about how you brought this data set together. We also internally, Mark Brown and others have been using some of the new spatial measures. If you were to, we always like to sort of build capacity amongst other users of our data. If you had to give a piece of advice, a warning about the data you use to the next researcher who wants to come in and use these data, what would it be?
I think it's fairly straightforward. I really appreciated when it came out. I was so happy. I started jumping in my bedroom because I was like, oh, this is amazing. And I was working on different data before that's like closer to the same thing, but it didn't measure it as precisely. So that was really good. I think I've tried to reach out to Stats Canada about the gravity models that were used to create the data, and I know they're coming out. but having, I think, more information about how those were built would help interpret some of these results better. So for instance, I have like this particular challenge. This might be too technical, but like I struggle a lot with it. So the measures are standardized as 0 to 1, a distance to the most, it's a standardized distance to the closest or the most distant possible amenity.
Right.
But sometimes 0 can be, that distance, but there's like probably a school that may happen to be just like 2 kilometers away or 1 kilometer away, and then like it doesn't get measured. So having the model would actually help to just like you can interpret a bit better, having the actual model there. So anyways, that's I think my piece of information that I would provide. Like wait for the model, like the gravity models to come out, so that you can have like better interpretation about that.
Okay, great. Well, please feel free to reach out, and I'll put you in touch with the folks who built those.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that.
Okay, do any of our other judges have a follow-on to their first question or a new line of inquiry? Okay. I had a few things. I'm going to build on Tammy's question. So there's a literature too, not just about where people decide to live, but what gets built. And I was trying to think about how you might be able to say something causal about your model. To what extent do you see, large philanthropic projects that maybe the populations have less influence over? And how would something like that look?
What do you mean by philanthropic projects, sorry?
A private donor comes in and decides to build a pool or something of that nature. I can't imagine it happens all that often in the data, but could you measure something using that kind of a project?
Yeah, I see that potentially happening. I think there's some of that. I mean, one neighborhood that's being overstudied here is Regent Park, as you probably know, and Regent Park has a combination of private investment and public investment, right? So one of the things that they may underlie those kinds of decisions, I think, has to do with how aware or interested people are in terms of where the funds come from for specific projects. And often it's more about how, at least in the context of some of these revitalization projects and things like that, one of the concerns that comes out in a lot of the policy evaluations that I've read has to do with less with who gives the money and more with how consistent the money flow is for like keeping that active. Let's say you build a pool, right? And then the pool needs maintenance. And then who is in charge of that? Like, how do you ensure money comes in constantly? And the problem is that all thing in terms of like, I don't know exactly how it would happen with like philanthropic projects, but in terms of public funding, there's concern about whether political changes, political realignments can have an impact on that. So that there's a new mayor, there's a new premier in the province, and then the funds run out, and then like the projects that you started that are helping dozens of kids, they're no longer there, right? So I think that's more what concerns come from, not specifically about who builds what, but how this goes on over time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Do you think there's anything about your findings that is sort of unique to the environment in which you're studying? Like, do you think we could export these findings to, say, Vancouver, Montreal, like, the other big CMAs, but then also, would this be appropriate for smaller towns?
Yeah, that's something I've tried a few models with only CMAs just because they offer the kind of heterogeneity that I wanted to see for now, and like an additional clustering level, right? So you have like this metropolitan dynamics of like suburban lifestyle really clearly versus kind of like downtown core. I think I'm usually very hesitant to go directly into trying them out. I want to do that, but I have only lived in Canada for 6 years now, and I only lived in big cities. So I'm not too familiar with like how like I would interpret the results that I could get from smaller towns or like smaller communities. I'm being hesitant just because of my personal experience is a bit limited on that. But I definitely would love to see how this would play out at another level. I think there may be similar patterns because a lot of these smaller towns that I've seen, at least in traveling, have adopted some of these urbanization and suburbanization patterns at a smaller scale. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure how it will look like. I mean, the models are there, like I could run them. It's just a matter of like, I would like to know a bit better how to interpret them before going ahead and talking about that.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Fernando. So if there's nothing else from anybody, we are going to take a. Oh, go ahead, Tammy.
I was going to say, just one more question came to mind while you were talking, and I did notice here. I don't remember the full dimensions of your data, but one thing that comes up in trying to measure things like trust, these very subjective measures, is that how people interpret questions can matter, and people in rural areas or different cities might answer very differently, even though they all equally trust in some way.
Yeah.
And also the ordering of questions and how they're worded, if that changes at all over time, it could completely change how people respond to the same question. So I'm just wondering if you ran into that at all or thought about that with this project.
Oh yeah, for sure. That's why my models have 4 variables, like the ones I'm reporting, but I've done these models with at least 16 different versions of the questions and things like that. And just to see consistency across time, for instance, this project started using 3 GSS years, 2003, 8, and 13. But then I had to drop the 2003 one because the consistency wasn't exact about like how the phrasing was done, and I was afraid that could affect the results. And the other thing is that luckily, I'm really glad that SATS Canada started doing this early on, that there's a bunch of different ways of asking the same thing. Like the construct is the same, trust, but then you have these vignette kind of questions where they ask people, do you think a stranger would return a wallet with $200 in it in the street, right? Like, and those, I've followed the literature on trust, and those usually measure much better the construct because they don't ask the question with the wording it, right? And there's very directed, so there's an object, like you trust someone to do something specific. So yeah, that's why these are the questions that I'm using mostly. The wallet vignette for me is one of the best questions available for that, because it's very targeted, it's very pointy, and it can be compared. Of course, like what people imagine to be a stranger, what people imagine to be neighbor will vary a lot in like different scales. So that's why, again, going back to Grant's question about like moving it on to other contexts, that may be a challenge because that I'm not too familiar with that other kind of environment. But yeah.
All right, well, thank you, Fernando. We did start a little bit early, unfortunately, so you did a little bit more work than maybe you had to. We're going to take a quick break and let our judges fill in their thoughts about your presentation. We'll come back with Katarina McKenzie at 1:05.
Thank you, everybody.